For 7 years, I had the privilege each summer of being the counselor at a 2-week summer institute for incoming college freshmen on the topic of theological explorations of vocation. And vocation, what you're going to do with your life, is a very live question for many of us, but especially for incoming college freshmen. The title of the program was, You Bet Your Life. And our goal was to equip these young people with tools, with frameworks, with experiences to begin discerning both their gifts and how they might best be able to change the world for the better with their particular gifts and graces. Because how we choose to spend our time and talents, that is that on which we bet our life. That's the thing worthy of spending our life on. One classic definition of vocation is that you are called to that place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. That you can most fruitfully spend your time at that place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. And each year, one of the most powerful ways that we invited the young people to experience the world's deep hunger was through a poverty tour of the city where we were, which happened to be Greenville, South Carolina. And up to this point, most of the campers had experienced Greenville. You know, on the first day, we take them to downtown Greenville. They get ice cream. We take them out to eat. They play in the park, bring Frisbees. They had experienced Greenville as this beautiful city, which it is, in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, with a revitalized and a flourishing downtown, much like our own downtown here in Frederick. A different view would emerge about a week later as we loaded the campers onto a bus driven by the local director of a nonprofit who had been working for decades to understand and address poverty in and around Greenville County. He would drive us down a major thoroughfare, one we had driven down to get to downtown Greenville. But at a certain point, those wide, smooth roads with, manicured, smooth sidewalks, he would just turn just one block over on the other side of the large trees. And suddenly, where you would have no reason to go if you didn't live in that neighborhood, suddenly the sidewalks disappeared. The roads narrowed to one lane, such that if one car was coming and you sometimes saw cars randomly parked on the side of the road just because there was no driveways, emergency vehicles would have no way to get in if that was the case. You would see dilapidated buildings hidden from citizens' views if you didn't live in that neighborhood and had no reason to go one block beyond that tree line of the major thoroughfare. There was much more to the tour. Another particularly impactful part, though, was he would take us around and show clear evidence of pallets where individuals had slept the night before and returned to sleep the next night, both under bridges and in bamboo fields, but all within view and close proximity to that downtown tourist mecca. The summer of 2001 was the first year of this camp on You Bet Your Life. And we were figuring out many of the details as we went. And one thing we hadn't fully accounted for was how impactful that poverty tour was going to be on some of the campers who had never thought about, some of them even their home city, in a city they'd been to before, through that lens. How emotionally it hit them, how viscerally it hit them. So we realized instead of just going back to campus, we needed to really thoroughly debrief this. So we gathered them in the parking lot. But the real breakthrough moment came beyond just kind of despairing when one of the counselors stepped forward and shared about his experience of having volunteered at this nonprofit where this director worked, and he had volunteered there for the previous 2 years. And in the face of so many individuals and so many families with overwhelming needs, he had found some reassurance from this story, which hung on the wall of that nonprofit. Some of you may have heard this before. A child is walking along the ocean and sees a beach on which thousands and thousands of starfish have washed ashore. Further along, she sees a woman walking slowly and stooping often and picking up one starfish at a time and chucking them back into the sea. Why are you throwing starfish into the ocean? The child asks. Because the sun is up and the tide is going out, and if I don't throw them back in, they're going to die. But the child says, there's so many, you can barely make a difference. And as she replies, the woman bends over, picks up yet one more starfish, gently tosses it back into the ocean, and says, "It made a difference to that one." My friend found comfort in the story, as did many of the campers. When he was overwhelmed with the immensity of poverty as this huge social problem, he would spend some time making a concrete difference in the life of at least one person. Getting at least one person enough food for the next month. Getting the water turned back on at least one person's house. Being fully present to listen to whoever was immediately in front of him and asking for his attention and help. Getting a desperately needed prescription filled for one person, or visiting one person who was in prison. Now, there's a lot of wisdom in that starfish story of helping one person. But here's another story that's become another touchstone for me as I've reflected on these large social problems in our society. Imagine a large river with a high waterfall. At the bottom of this waterfall, you come across hundreds of people working frantically to save people who have fallen into the river and cannot swim. Many of them are beginning to drown. As the people along the shore are trying to rescue as many people as possible, one individual looks up and sees a never-ending stream of people falling off the waterfall into the river and contributing more people, even as a few, one by one, are being pulled out from drowning. One of the rescuers, and he begins to run upstream. One of the rescuers hollers, "Where are you going? There's so many people right here to help." To which the man replies, "I'm going upstream to find out why people keep falling in the river." The starfish story reminds us that at minimum we can make immediate real differences in people's lives through simple acts of loving kindness. But the river story reminds us that it's not enough to just be the change we want to see in the world. We need to start there. But in addition to working on a one-on-one level, we also need to work to change the larger systems of injustice. But moving from the individual level to the systemic level becomes not arithmetically more complicated, but geometrically, infinitely more complicated. And in the words of a Catholic liberation theologian and former Archbishop of Brazil, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint for giving food to the poor. But when I ask why there are so many poor people, they call me a communist." Or as I said last week, I'm incredibly grateful and proud of this congregation and so many others in our community, individuals in other congregations, for coming together and beginning to form this family emergency shelter for families in our community who find themselves temporarily homeless. We are right to begin with providing shelter, just some safe place overnight for families with children in our community who right now are homeless. But we also need to take the insights that we're going to begin to learn from that experience, what we hear from these individuals and how they became temporarily homeless, to advocate for systematic change in our county, in our city, in our nation, in our world, about the lack of affordable housing and jobs that pay a living wage. Along these lines, at this past year's UU General Assembly, I was challenged particularly by two speakers. The first was Dr. Marshall Gans, who's the senior lecturer for public policy at Harvard University in their Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Gans' father was a rabbi and his mother a teacher. He grew up in the San Joaquin Valley of California at the end point, that's the end point of the Dust Bowl. If any of you have read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, that was the story of the San Joaquin Valley in the early part of the 20th century. Gans graduated from high school in that auspicious year of 1960, the year Kennedy was elected president, and in those heady times, Gans, the son of a rabbi, dropped out of Harvard in his undergraduate year, his junior year, to join the Civil Rights Movement full-time as an organizer in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC. Then, following the passage of the Voting Rights Act, he returned to his home state of California in 1965 and joined Cesar Chavez and that effort to unionize California farm workers. And after 16 years with the United Farm Workers, Gans felt the need to deepen his intellectual understanding. So he had a lot of practical experience. Now, how can I build a better theory? How can we replicate the good parts of what we've learned? so to supplement and extend his on-the-ground organizing experience. So after a 28-year leave of absence, Gans returned to Harvard, completed his undergraduate degree in history and government, got a master's in public administration and a PhD in sociology in 2000. He jokes that he's part of Harvard's class of 1964/1992. More recently, Gans famously consulted with the Obama campaign, some of you remember that, in the spring of 2007, to help then-candidate Obama better tell his story. And the Obama campaign wanted to learn from Gans' experience as an organizer and his work with Cesar Chavez to set up intensive community organizing style training camps in which young people would be trained to tell Obama's story, to spread a message and generate enthusiasm as a grassroots movement. Now, of course, the rest of how that went is history, and now we have not candidate Obama, but President Obama. But it's worth knowing that President Obama's famous slogan, "Yes, we can," that's a direct translation of Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers rallying cry that started back in 1972. Before there was "Yes, we can," there was "Sí, se puede." And Dr. Gans, in reflecting on his decades of organizing experience through his doctoral work and teaching at Harvard, has written a book called Why David Sometimes Wins. David doesn't always win. Maybe more often David doesn't win, but sometimes David wins, and he's interested in why. That's referring to that ancient biblical tale that he likely first heard from his father, the rabbi, of David and Goliath. And in that classic story, the Philistine champion, the giant Goliath, has been taunting the Israelites for 40 days. And finally, David, a young shepherd boy, courageously offers, all you soldiers who have been cowering for 40 days, he's like, "I'll take on Goliath." He's taunting our people. And at first the soldiers say, "All right, well, let's equip him with the king's own armor." So they take this young shepherd boy, they put the mail and the helmet and the king's sword onto him. He couldn't even walk with all that on. And he realizes that he can't take on Goliath on Goliath's own terms. So looking around in a nearby riverbed, he sees 5 smooth stones. And as a shepherd boy, he's used stones in a slingshot to defend his sheep from wild animals. And so he defeats Goliath by surprising the giant with a rock to the forehead. He stuns him, then takes Goliath's own sword and finishes the job. Prior to Chavez's work in California, there had been 3 waves of farm labor organizing since 1900. But Gans reflects that, like David, Chavez succeeded where others had failed because he thought differently about the problem and because he was more motivated. He applied the resources at hand in novel, unexpected ways. Cesar Chavez used to say that power makes you stupid. In Gans's words, the Goliaths of this world arrogantly come to rely on overwhelming resource advantages, which is exactly what creates opportunities for the Davids of this world. So what does that mean for all of us? Well, as with the starfish story, we know that we can and should begin with doing what we can for individuals and families right in front of us. But if we also, like the river story, find ourselves wanting to go upstream and begin to take on the bigger Goliath-like problems of why people are falling into the river in the first place, to both give food to the poor and to ask why there are so many poor people in the first place, what then are the ways that we might be able to learn from archetypal Davids, like Chavez, like Gans, like Obama, and others? If we might someday find the boldness and the courage to work both on the individual level and on the systemic level to take on those Goliath-sized social problems. I know some of you are in the sun. If you need to move, please at any time during the service, move. I know it can get bright out there. So one way we might begin to take on a Goliath-sized social problem is by looking to our own tradition. What is it about being a theological liberal? That doesn't necessarily mean you're a political liberal, but if you're a theological liberal, how might that help us think differently about these social problems? How might that equip us as Davids? Looking to our own tradition, James Luther Adams, probably the most famous UU theologian of the 20th century. He's usually affectionately known as JLA. He offers us one framework for thinking differently and applying resources in novel ways, what he calls his 5 smooth stones of religious liberalism. He's making an explicit allusion there to the David and Goliath story. His 5 smooth stones are: 1, that we see revelation as continuous. There wasn't just some revelation in the past that we have to just rely on that. We see revelation, new learning as continuous. That's part of why we embrace science. So as a liberal religious tradition, we're not locked into the traditions of the past, making us particularly David-like in our openness to innovations from any quarter. The second smooth stone is mutual free consent, that we don't believe in coercion. We believe in mutual free consent. Goliath models rely on a top-down, tightly controlled hierarchy, but our 5th principle commitment to the democratic process keeps us open to all voices, including those David-like voices from the margins that can point us toward previously unforeseen ways forward. The third smooth stone that we can have in our slingshot is the moral obligation to direct one's effort toward the establishment of a just and loving community. At least for James Luther Adams, for JLA, it's not actually optional. Being a religious liberal means you have a moral obligation to work toward creating a just and loving community. And that's that motivation. It's why Cesar Chavez succeeded where the 3 others failed. They gave up. He just kept coming. And that's what, in JLA's words, religious liberalism obligates us to do. And then the Goliaths of this world insist that the way things are, which of course favor the Goliaths, that's how they got to be so big and powerful in the first place, they say, that's just the way things are. The status quo is the way things have to be. And we say, no, they can be different. The 4th smooth stone is that we deny the immaculate conception, not of Jesus, but of virtue. We deny that too. But the immaculate conception of virtue. In other words, the world doesn't magically bend toward justice. It only bends through the collective human effort toward positive social change. And the 5th smooth stone is optimism. We persist in the hope and the possibility of moving incrementally toward a better world. Those are the 5 smooth stones that might help us think and act differently in this world. To briefly name what such a process might look like on the ground here in Frederick, I mentioned earlier that there were 2 speakers at this year's UU General Assembly that particularly challenged me in particular. The first was Dr. Gans. The second was the Sunday sermon by my colleague, the Reverend Mark Stringer. I'll link to that in this sermon if you'd like to either listen to or read the full sermon on the UUA's website. But in short, Stringer spoke movingly about what he has learned by reaching across both cultural and theological lines to try to build coalitions of very diverse congregations in his community of Des Moines, Iowa, using a congregational-based organizing model, very much like what Gans and others recommend. Closer to home, similar coalitions have been built in Montgomery County very successfully. I just saw my colleague, the Reverend Nancy Ladd from River Road, was at with a very diverse group of coalitions. They disagree about a lot of things. They can't always work together for things like same-sex marriage. Sometimes the religious liberals ride on their own on that one, but they can work together and were yesterday on Habitat for Humanity houses, saying we need to provide a simple, decent place to live. So that's what he was saying is let's work together and build networks to work together on social problems as far and as long as we can. So they're Montgomery County, Baltimore County, D.C., and I'm interested in what we might do similar to that in Frederick County, and exploring how these partnerships that were already forming with congregations that we weren't really in contact with before, but now are through the Family Emergency Shelter, how that might be the seed of a similar effort here in Frederick County, of a more robust, broad-based organizing network to create greater social, economic, and environmental justice in our community and in our world. And as we explored some last week, our greatest hope for change, it doesn't come from independence, from us just being a voice crying in the wilderness. Our greatest hope for change comes from interdependence, and not just here in our diversity, but the full diversity of our community. We need one another in all our diversity, and we're stronger together. For now, in that spirit, I'll leave you with these words that are called the Franciscan blessing from the tradition of St. Francis of Assisi, who was known for his work for peace and with the poor. May you be blessed with discomfort. May you be blessed with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, that you may live deep within your heart. May you be blessed with anger. May you be blessed with anger at injustice, at oppression, at the exploitation of people, that you may work, that anger may motivate you to work and not give up for justice for all people. May you be blessed with tears, tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, from hunger, from homelessness and rejection, that you might take the risk of reaching out your hand to help and comfort them, to change their life and your life. And may you be blessed with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, that together we might do something that others claim cannot be done.